It was one of those rare moments when the world seemed to pause, as if the universe itself had given Keanu Reeves a brief respite from the chaos of fame. The park was bustling with activity, joggers looping around the track, children laughing, as they played on the swings, and the distant chatter of families enjoying the bright afternoon. Keanu sat on a metal bench near the fountain, his hands clasped around a coffee cup, trying to blend into the crowd. The last thing he wanted was attention, but he knew it was impossible to escape the prying eyes of the public for long. As much as he longed for anonymity, he found solace in this moment of normalcy. His dark sunglasses shielded him from the direct glare of the sun, and the soft rustling of the leaves in the trees was calming. The distant hum of traffic and the faint laughter of children reminded him that, for all the glitz and glamour of Hollywood, there were still simple pleasures to be found in the world. Keanu was lost in the tranquility of the park when, without warning, his peaceful moment was shattered by the sudden appearance of 3 police officers. They approached him with an unsettling level of confidence, their uniforms crisply pressed, and their eyes scanning the area as if they were searching for something or someone. "Hey, you! Stand up!" one of them said gruffly. Keanu blinked, his heart skipping a beat. It was the last thing he expected on a day like this. He didn't recognize the officer who spoke. He was tall, with a square jaw and a no-nonsense expression. "Is there a problem?" Keanu asked, trying to keep his voice steady. He was aware of the sudden shift in the atmosphere around him. People were beginning to notice the commotion. "Stand up now," the officer repeated, his tone sharper this time. There was no room for negotiation in his voice. Keanu's brow furrowed, in confusion, his mind racing. He had been targeted by the public's obsession before, but this was different. He wasn't prepared for an interaction like this with the police. "Look, I don't know what's going on, but I'm just trying to enjoy my day," Keanu explained, standing slowly as he reached for his sunglasses to take them off. He figured it might help ease the tension, though something told him it wasn't going to be that simple. The officer didn't budge. Instead, he took a step forward, his hand hovering near his belt as if ready to draw his handcuffs. The other officers flanked him, one to the left and one to the right, their presence making Keanu feel more and more cornered. "You match the description of a suspect. We need to check you," the officer said, his eyes narrowing. "We're not asking." Keanu's eyes scanned the officers' faces. None of them seemed familiar, but the tension in the air was palpable. The other people in the park were starting to watch, some pulling out their phones to capture what was happening. The peaceful park scene was now filled with an undercurrent of fear and confusion. Wait," Keanu said, his voice a little more urgent now. "There must be some mistake. I'm not the guy you're looking for." The officer didn't respond, his face hardening. "You're not making this easy. Step over here," he commanded. Keanu's pulse quickened. This was all happening so fast, and he didn't know how to get out of it. But he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let the situation escalate further. He could feel the weight of the crowd's eyes on him, and the pressure of the moment was mounting. He glanced around the park, hoping for some sign of intervention. But the people nearby only stared, too afraid to step in. He stood slowly, trying to stay calm. The last thing he wanted was for the situation to spiral out of control. Before Keanu could say anything else, Officer Ben's voice cut through the tension. "Are you resisting?" he asked, his tone now icy. "We can make this easy, or we can make it difficult. Your choice." Keanu's heart pounded. He opened his mouth to explain again, but something in the officer's stance made him pause. This wasn't just an ordinary interaction. Something was off, and Keanu didn't know how to navigate it. And then, just as quickly as the officers had appeared, the situation went from bad to worse. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward even when things get tough? The air around Keanu seemed to thicken, each passing second making the situation feel more suffocating. Officer Ben's gaze was fixed on him, unwavering like a predator sizing up its prey. The other officers remained silent, their hands still hovering near their belts, their postures tense. Keanu's mind raced. He was caught in a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief, struggling to make sense of what was happening. "I'm telling you, I don't know what you're talking about," Keanu said, his voice steady, but laced with a hint of frustration. The last thing he wanted was to make the situation worse, but his patience was wearing thin. He had dealt with his fair share of misinterpretations in the past, but this felt different. This felt dangerous. "How you're not helping yourself," Officer Ben said coldly. "We don't have time for this. Either you comply or we'll take this further." Keanu's eyes flicked to the growing crowd around them. The whispers were starting to get louder. Some people were filming, their phones raised high, capturing every moment of the confrontation. Keanu, usually so composed in the face of the media frenzy, now found himself under an entirely different kind of pressure. Keanu tried to remain calm, his fingers tightening around the cup in his hand. He'd been in tense situations before, red. Carpets, press conferences, paparazzi chases, but nothing compared to the feeling of being surrounded by law enforcement with no explanation. Was it because he looked like someone they were searching for? Was he in the wrong place at the wrong time? "Look, I get it," Keanu said, taking a step back. "I don't know what you're looking for, but I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just sitting here. Please, let me go." He raised his hands slightly, signaling that he meant no harm. But Officer Ben wasn't listening. He stepped forward, closing the space between them with deliberate force. "We don't have time for games, Reeves. Stand still." The use of his last name hit Keanu harder than expected. The officer's familiarity with him, not as a person but as a celebrity, added another layer of strangeness to the situation. His heart skipped a beat, but Keanu tried to shake it off, focusing on the task at hand, getting out of this without escalating the situation any further. "Can you just tell me what this is about?" Keanu asked, the tension in his voice now clear. "Why am I being treated like this?" "You're resisting," Ben shot back, his voice growing louder. "Do you want to make it harder on yourself?" Keanu's chest tightened, the realization sinking in that this wasn't a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a polite conversation. This was escalating fast, and the consequences could be severe. He could already feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him, the fear creeping in, but he refused to show it, not in front of a crowd. The officer beside Ben, a woman with short blonde hair, stepped forward. "He's not cooperating. I think it's time to cuff him." Her voice was sharp, cutting through the tension like a blade. Keanu's eyes widened. His mind screamed for clarity, for some sort of intervention, but he had no control over what was happening. As the officer reached for her cuffs, Keanu instinctively took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. "Please," he said, his voice lower now, more pleading. "This isn't necessary. I swear I'm not the guy you're looking for." But his words fell on deaf ears. Before he could react, Ben lunged forward, grabbing Keanu's arm with surprising force. The motion was quick, almost too quick, and Keanu stumbled slightly as the officer twisted his wrist. The crowd gasped, the tension escalating like a storm brewing on the horizon. "Get off me," Keanu shouted, pulling his arm free. His mind raced, but his body was moving on instinct. He didn't want to make the situation worse, but he wasn't going to let this happen. In that instant, the crowd grew louder, some people shouting for the police to stop, others filming the scene on their phones. It felt as though the whole world was watching. Keanu's breath quickened as he tried to keep his balance. His thoughts scrambled. How had it come to this? All he wanted was to enjoy a peaceful afternoon, but now it seemed he was caught in the middle of a storm he had no way of controlling. Officer Ben's grip tightened, his frustration evident. "You're not helping yourself, Reeves," he spat. "You're making this worse." Keanu's mind was spinning. He hadn't resisted. He hadn't done anything wrong. And yet, he was now in the grip of a situation he could not escape. But just as the tension reached a breaking point, a voice called out from the crowd, cutting through the chaos. "Ben?" The voice was familiar, warm, with an edge of surprise. Ben turned, his grip on Keanu loosening for a brief moment. The officer's eyes widened as he recognized the voice. It was then that Keanu finally understood. The world had returned to its noisy, bustling rhythm, but Keanu still felt the weight of the incident pressing against his chest. As he sat there on the park bench, surrounded by the lingering whispers of the crowd, his mind raced. What had just happened? It was as if the universe had flipped a switch, dragging him into a strange and uncomfortable reality where even a simple afternoon coffee could turn into a confrontation with the law. It wasn't just about the officers anymore. It was about something deeper, something that hadn't fully sunk in yet. He took a deep breath, trying to shake off the tension. The park, once a place of solace, now felt different. The trees seemed less inviting, the distant sounds of children playing now a reminder of just how much his life had been altered by a single moment of misunderstanding. Was he really this, vulnerable? Was anyone safe in this world? He stood up slowly, clutching his coffee cup as if it were the only thing anchoring him to reality. The chaos was over, but the sense of unease remained. He glanced around the park, half expecting someone to approach him again, but the people had mostly dispersed. The crowd had thinned, leaving only a few scattered joggers and families going about their day. Keanu began walking, his footsteps slow and measured. He didn't know where he was headed, but he needed to get away from that spot. He needed to process what had happened, and the only way to do that was to clear his head. As he walked down the park's winding path, his mind kept drifting back to the incident. The officers had apologized, sure, but the damage was done. His heart still raced when he thought of how quickly things had spiraled out of control. How had he gotten to this point? The thought of being treated like a suspect, an ordinary man, suddenly thrust into a dangerous, escalating situation, shocked him. For the first time in a long time, Keanu felt powerless. Suddenly, his phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking his train of thought. He pulled it out and saw a message notification from his longtime manager, Claire. "Hey, just saw what happened. You okay?" Keanu paused for a moment, staring at the screen. He wanted to respond, but part of him hesitated. What could he say? That it had been a misunderstanding? That it had all been some kind of random chaos he never saw coming? Instead, he typed back quickly, "I'm fine. Just a little shaken up, but I'll be okay. Thanks for checking in." He hit send and shoved the phone back into his pocket. The last thing he wanted to do was dwell on the incident. There had to be something, anything to distract him, to make him feel normal again. And then, as if on cue, the park's exit appeared ahead, leading to the busy streets that Keanu knew so well. The city felt like a lifeline, a place he could disappear into. He thought about his options. He could go home, retreat to the quiet of his apartment, where he would be alone with his thoughts. Or he could take a different route, dare to walk through the streets and get lost in the crowd. The idea of disappearing for a while appealed to him. He needed space, freedom, a break from all the chaos. He chose the latter. As Keanu walked out of the park and onto the bustling sidewalk, the noise of the city enveloped him. The hum of cars, the chatter of pedestrians, and the occasional honking horn. It all blended together into a familiar soundtrack. For a moment it felt like nothing had changed. He was just another person in the crowd, anonymous and ordinary. It was a strange, calming thought. His feet carried him without thinking. He walked through streets he had walked countless times before, passing by familiar storefronts and the occasional street performer. Despite the surreal experience earlier, Keanu couldn't help but feel a strange sense of peace. Maybe this was what he needed after all, just to be in the world, unbothered by the expectations that seemed to follow him wherever he went. He made a left turn onto a quieter street, where the buildings were a little older and the foot traffic a little less dense. He wasn't sure where he was going, but he didn't really care. He just needed a moment, one moment, to let everything fade away. And that was when he saw her. A woman was standing outside a small cafe, sipping from a coffee cup as she gazed up at the sky. She was dressed casually in a simple denim jacket, her brown hair pulled back into a loose ponytail. She didn't seem to notice Keanu at first, but as he walked closer, she glanced over at him. For a split second, their eyes met. And in that instant, Keanu felt something stir in his chest, a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time, a connection. She smiled, a subtle, knowing smile. Not the kind of smile someone would give a celebrity, but the kind of smile someone would give a person who had simply crossed their path and shared a quiet, unspoken understanding. Keanu stopped in his tracks, caught off guard by the moment. He hadn't expected to feel anything like this. It was just a glance, a fleeting connection between two strangers, but it felt like something more. It was like the world had slowed down just for that brief instant, and for the first time that day, Keanu felt a sense of relief. He wasn't just a celebrity under attack. He was a man, a person who could still find these moments of peace in the middle of all the noise. He walked over to her, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. As he approached, she tilted her head slightly, the smile still on her face. She took another sip from her coffee and then spoke, her voice light but warm. "Are you lost, or are you just looking for a reason to smile?" Keanu chuckled softly, his heart lifting just a little. Maybe a little bit of both. The world seemed to fade away again as they stood there, two strangers connected by an unexpected moment. For the first time in what felt like forever, Keanu didn't feel like he had to be anyone but himself. The conversation with the woman was brief, but it left Keanu feeling something unexpected. It was like a quiet storm in his chest, something deep and unsettling, yet oddly reassuring. Her smile, the ease with which they shared that brief connection, seemed to pull him back from the whirlwind that had taken over his mind since the incident with the police. As she took another sip of her coffee, Keanu felt himself lingering on. The moment, the chaotic events of the day, the tension, the aggression, it all seemed to melt away for a brief second. He found himself taking a deep breath, realizing just how much he had been holding on to. "Thanks," Keanu said, his voice softer than before. "I didn't expect to find some peace in the middle of all this. You made me forget about everything." The woman gave him a gentle, knowing nod. "Sometimes you have to stop and breathe, even when the world feels like it's crashing down around you," she replied. Her words weren't just comforting. They were a reminder that the world wasn't all bad, that there was more to life than the pressures and chaos. For a moment, Keanu felt like he was truly seeing the world again. The noise of the city faded into the background, and all that remained was the strange but calming presence of this stranger, and the fact that he was not as alone as he had felt moments before. He had no idea who she was, but it didn't matter. In this moment, she was just someone who had given him the kind of comfort he hadn't known he needed. "I'll let you get back to your day," Keanu said, giving a small smile. "But it was nice to meet you, even if it was just for a few minutes." Before she could respond, Keanu turned away. But as he took his first step, something unexpected happened. The woman called out to him. "Keanu," she said, her voice firm and direct, "don't let them get to you." He turned back to her, confused for a second. "What do you mean?" "The people who want to see you fall. The ones who make you feel small," she explained, her tone unwavering. "Don't let them control your narrative. You're not the mistake they want to paint you as. You're better than that." Keanu stood frozen, the words settling deep into his chest. He had never expected a stranger, someone who knew nothing about his life or struggles, to speak with such understanding. But there was something in her voice, a truth, a clarity, that resonated with him on a level he couldn't quite explain. "Thank you," Keanu finally said, his voice catching slightly. He didn't have the words to express what he was feeling, but he didn't need to. Her message was clear. He didn't have to carry the weight of the world's expectations or the mistakes of others. As he walked away from the cafe, a feeling of clarity washed over him. He didn't have to be weighed down by everything that had happened that day. He could walk through the chaos and still find peace. He could still be himself, even when the world seemed determined to put him in a box. The sounds of the city seemed less oppressive now. The people around him no longer felt like potential threats. He didn't have to be perfect. He didn't have to control everything. All he had to do was keep moving forward. Keanu walked for what felt like hours, his mind quieting with each step. The once overwhelming sense of fear had been replaced with a steady confidence he hadn't realized he was missing. The day had started as one of the most unnerving experiences of his life, but now it was transforming into something else, a reminder that the world wasn't just full of the noise and aggression he had encountered, but full of moments of kindness, understanding, and quiet strength. And then, as he turned down a quieter street near his apartment, his phone buzzed again. "Keanu, you good? I saw the video. That was insane. You okay?" It was Claire again. Keanu smiled, shaking his head as he typed back, "Yeah, I'm fine. Everything's going to be all right, thanks for checking in." But this time his words carried more than just reassurance. They carried a promise to himself. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He was going to keep pushing forward. He wouldn't let the world define him. Not anymore. He was Keanu Reeves, not the victim of a misunderstanding, not a celebrity caught in the crossfire of a chaotic world, but a man who had been given a chance to reset. A man who had learned something valuable about himself in the most unexpected way. Keanu continued his walk, not knowing where it would lead, but certain that, for the first time in a long while, he was headed in the right direction. Keanu woke up the next morning with a sense of calm he hadn't felt in days. The events from the park, the police officers, the unexpected moment of connection with the woman, it all seemed like a distant memory now, like a chapter in a book that had already been closed. The world, despite the chaos that had surrounded him, had somehow found a way to reset. He went through his morning routine with a sense of purpose, as if the simple act of making his coffee and reading the news were a reaffirmation that life, despite its unpredictability, went on. But there was a subtle shift inside him, a realization that had crystallized over the course of the previous day. He didn't need to be in control of everything. The world was going to do what it was going to do. People were going to have opinions, assumptions and judgments, but none of that would define him. He had the power to decide who he was and who he would continue to be. By the time he finished his breakfast, he found himself scrolling through his phone, looking at the flood of messages from fans, friends, and colleagues. Some were concerned about the incident, some were simply offering kind words of encouragement. But there was one message that stood out, Claire's text from last night. "I'm glad you're okay. You don't have to go through this alone, Keanu. If you ever need to talk, I'm here." He paused for a moment, fingers hovering over the screen. He had known Claire for years, but even after all their time together, he rarely opened up about the weight he carried as a public figure. There were so many things he had to keep private, so many layers of his life that couldn't be shared. But today, for some reason, he felt like he wanted to let someone in. He typed a quick response. "Thanks, Claire. I appreciate it more than... I'm good though, really. Just taking things one step at a time." As he hit send, he leaned back in his chair and took a deep breath. Today was a new day. And with it, he felt a new sense of resolve. The next few hours passed quietly. He spent time reviewing scripts, making calls and responding to emails. But as the afternoon wore on, something in him nudged him toward action. He needed to do something outside of his usual routine, something to break the monotony. After the events of the previous day, he wasn't sure if it was the right time to venture out, but something told him it was. The park. Keanu hadn't planned to go back there, but now it seemed like the perfect place to do what he had to do. To face the place where everything had started. It wasn't about seeking closure necessarily, but more about reclaiming his space, reclaiming his peace. He grabbed his jacket and left his apartment, the cool air of the city brushing against his face as he made his way out. The city felt different today, less chaotic, more serene. Maybe it was the new perspective he had gained, or maybe it was simply that he was no longer as affected by the noise. Either way, it felt good to step out, to live in the moment, and to embrace whatever came his way. The park was quieter than he remembered, the sounds of the city distant and muted in the background. Keanu walked the familiar path again, the very same path where everything had gone wrong the day before. But today it felt different. He was in control. He took a seat on a bench near the fountain, the sound of water cascading softly filling the air. As he sat there, he felt the tension in his body slowly melt away piece by piece. It was almost like he had returned to a place of comfort, a place where he could just be himself. And then, just as he was starting to relax, he heard footsteps approaching. He turned his head to find the woman from the cafe walking toward him. The same calm expression on her face, a coffee cup in her hand. She smiled as she saw him sitting there. "I didn't expect to find you here," she said, her voice light, but there was something deeper in her tone, something like understanding. Keanu couldn't help but smile back. "I didn't expect to be here either," he said, his voice soft as if the conversation itself was a quiet realization. "But I guess I needed to be." She took a seat beside him on the bench, offering him a gentle nod. Sometimes the universe has a funny way of pulling us back to places we need to be, even when we don't realize it. He thought about her words for a moment, the weight of them settling into his chest. It was strange. He had come to the park to reclaim something, to find peace, but maybe in that moment it wasn't just the park he was reclaiming. It was his own sense of self. "You're right," he said, glancing over at her. "I've been chasing peace for a while now, and it feels like I'm finally getting a taste of it." She nodded thoughtfully, looking ahead at the fountain where the water flowed rhythmically. "Peace doesn't always come in the way we expect it, but when it hits hard." Keanu took a deep breath. The events of the past 24 hours had been a whirlwind, but now, sitting next to this stranger, someone who had come into his life so unexpectedly, he felt like he was finally starting to understand the bigger picture. "You know," Keanu said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I think I've been looking for peace in all the wrong places. Always trying to control everything, trying to make sure nothing goes wrong, but sometimes you have to let go." The woman turned to him, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "You've learned that quickly." "I guess," he chuckled, "but I don't think it's ever too late to start learning." For the first time in a long time, Keanu felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, not just in the park, not just in the city, but within himself. The journey had been difficult, but the moments of doubt, of fear, and of anger had led him here, to this moment of clarity. And in that moment, Keanu knew he had taken his first, real step forward. The following week passed in a blur for Keanu. The sense of peace he had found in the park lingered, but the incident was still on his mind. Though his day-to-day life had resumed its regular pace, there was an unease that clung to him. It wasn't that he hadn't learned valuable lessons in the past few days. It was just that something still felt unresolved. He couldn't shake. The feeling that the police encounter wasn't the only thing out of the ordinary that day. There was something deeper beneath the surface, something that had been left unsaid. One afternoon, after finishing a meeting with his team, Keanu found himself walking the same route through the city that had become his usual escape. The streets were lively, the sounds of people talking and the hum of distant traffic filling the air. He hadn't planned to go to the park again, but as his feet guided him there instinctively, he knew he had to revisit it, if only to put his thoughts in order. As he approached the park, the familiar view of trees and benches gave him the strange feeling of déjà vu. This place had already played such a pivotal role in his life. It was almost as if the park had become a part of him, and no matter how hard he tried to avoid it, he was always drawn back. He spotted a few familiar faces, families, joggers, a man walking his dog, but his eyes instinctively scanned the space. And that was when he saw her. The woman from the cafe, the one who had spoken so wisely to him about peace, was sitting on the same bench near the fountain. She wasn't alone this time. Beside her sat another man, slightly older, with a stern look on his face. The man was wearing a suit, his posture rigid. Keanu felt a slight pang in his chest, the curiosity creeping back in. Something about the scene didn't sit right with him. He hesitated for a moment before walking over, trying to suppress the sudden tension in his body. As he approached, the woman noticed him, and her face lit up with a warm smile, her eyes bright with recognition. "Keanu," she said, her voice carrying an inviting tone. "It's good to see you again." Keanu nodded, though he felt a strange knot in his stomach. There was an unspoken tension between the woman and the man sitting next to her. It wasn't obvious, but it was there, lingering in the way the man shifted his weight, in the way the woman avoided looking at him directly. "I didn't expect to see you here again," Keanu said, keeping his voice casual. "I thought maybe I was the only one who needed to return." The woman smiled, but it was a bittersweet smile, as if she knew something he didn't. Sometimes the universe brings us back to places we need to be, even if we don't fully understand why. Keanu was about to respond when the man beside her spoke up, his voice sharp and authoritative. "Keanu Reeves, isn't it?" Keanu turned toward the man, his instincts immediately on alert. Something about the way the man addressed him felt off. "That's right," Keanu replied, offering a polite but cautious nod. "And you are." The man hesitated for just a moment before giving a tight smile. "Detective Scott, I'm with the local precinct." He gestured toward the woman. "And this is Sarah, my colleague." Sarah? The name echoed in Keanu's mind, but it didn't quite fit with the image he had of her. Her calm demeanor, the way she had spoken with such wisdom, had never suggested she was involved with law enforcement. But as he looked at the detective's stern face, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this situation than met the eye. "Detective," Keanu said, his voice steady but laced with curiosity, "what can I do for you?" Sarah's eyes flicked to the detective, then back to Keanu, a fleeting look of unease flashing across her face before she quickly masked it with a calm expression. Keanu didn't miss it. "We wanted to talk to you about the incident in the park," Detective Scott said, his tone authoritative but not unkind. "There are some things we need to clear up." Keanu's heart skipped a beat. The incident, he hadn't expected anyone from the force to follow up with him. What more could there be to discuss? The whole thing had been a misunderstanding, a simple case of overzealous officers. "Isn't everything already resolved?" Keanu asked, confusion creeping into his voice. Detective Scott leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly as he spoke. "Not exactly. You see, there's something we need to investigate further, something we believe may not have been a simple misunderstanding after all." Keanu's stomach churned. What was this all about? His mind raced back to the incident. He had been shaken up at the time, but now with the detective sitting across from him, he felt a growing sense of dread. What was he missing? Sarah, who had been quiet for most of the exchange, finally spoke. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant, but it carried a weight that Keanu couldn't ignore. "There's something we think you should know," she said, her eyes meeting Keanu's with a strange intensity. "This incident, it wasn't random. There are people out there who are trying to make you a target." Keanu's breath caught in his throat. Target? For what? Sarah seemed to sense his confusion, and she quickly clarified. "It's not personal, but whoever was behind this, they want to cause chaos. And you, Keanu, might just be in the middle of it." Keanu felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He had always known that being in the public eye came with risks, but he had never imagined anything like this. Someone was out there, working behind the scenes to destabilize his life, to make him a part of something bigger than he could ever have imagined. He turned to Detective Scott, his voice hoarse. "What exactly are you saying?" "We believe," Scott said slowly, "that your run-in with the officers wasn't just a case of mistaken identity. It was part of a much larger scheme, and it's just the beginning." The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud, each syllable crashing into Keanu with the weight of an unexpected truth. Everything had changed in that moment. The world around him, his seemingly peaceful walk through the park, his quiet conversations with Sarah, had just transformed into something darker. The air in the park felt suddenly thick, the sounds of birds chirping and distant conversations fading into a dull hum. Keanu sat back, his mind spinning as he absorbed what Sarah and Detective Scott had just told him. A larger scheme? A conspiracy? This was far beyond anything he had imagined when he first set foot in this park days ago. What started as an ordinary day, interrupted by an unfortunate encounter with a few aggressive police officers, had now unraveled into something far more dangerous. Keanu looked from Sarah to Detective Scott, trying to piece together the fragmented pieces of the puzzle they had just thrown at him. His mind raced. "So, you're saying someone orchestrated that incident? That it wasn't just some random misunderstanding with the cops?" Detective Scott's face remained as cold and stern as before, but there was a flicker of something darker in his eyes. "That's exactly what we're saying. Someone knew what was going to happen. They had the officers involved and used them as pawns to make their move." Keanu stood up abruptly, pacing in a small circle. "But why? What would anyone gain by setting me up like that? I'm just an actor. Why go through all this trouble?" Sarah looked at him with a mixture of sympathy and apprehension. "Keanu, it's not about you personally. It's about the message you represent, the public image you've cultivated. People want to tear it down. It's the kind of manipulation that can spin out of control, and you, as an easy target, ended up in the middle of it. People? Keanu echoed, his voice quieter now. He had always been wary of the way the public viewed him. He knew how quickly a story could spiral out of control, how a simple misstep could cause chaos, but he never imagined that something as simple as a misunderstanding in the park could be part of a much larger scheme. Who would do this? Keanu asked, his voice shaking slightly now. Who would want to destroy my life over something like this? Detective Scott leaned in, his tone more serious than ever. We don't have all the answers yet, but we know this isn't just about you. This is about something bigger. Someone is trying to destabilize the system, using people like you as pawns to get their message across. We've seen similar patterns in other cases. Other cases? Keanu asked, now even more on edge. What do you mean? The people behind this are organized, Sarah interjected, her tone grave. They have resources, they have influence, and they've used this same technique before, creating chaos, putting people in the middle of it, making sure that everything around them falls apart. And when it's all over, they walk away unscathed, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. Keanu felt a sudden weight in his chest. So I'm just a pawn in a game that's much bigger than me? Sarah nodded slowly, her eyes softening with empathy. In a way, yes, but you don't have to be. You can choose how to respond to this. We're giving you a chance to take control of your narrative, to stay ahead of the game. Keanu stopped pacing, feeling a mix of emotions washing over him. Anger, confusion, fear. He had always prided himself on maintaining control of his own life, his own story. But now he was up against something far more sinister than a few overzealous cops. He had no idea who was behind this, but one thing was clear. They wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. What can I do? Keanu finally asked, his voice tight with resolve. What's the next step? Detective Scott exchanged a glance with Sarah before speaking. We need to keep this under wraps for now. The less people know, the better. The more attention this gets, the more they'll tighten their grip on the situation. But we'll be watching, and we'll be ready. We just need to stay one step ahead of them. Keanu nodded, the weight of the situation sinking in. This wasn't just about a personal vendetta or some random act of violence. There were powerful people behind this, people who knew exactly how to manipulate the media, the public, and even law enforcement. And if Keanu wasn't careful, he could easily be swallowed up in the storm they were creating. As Sarah and Detective Scott got up to leave, Sarah paused for a moment, her gaze lingering on Keanu. Remember, she said softly, they want to control the narrative. Don't give them that power. You have more control than you think. Keanu watched them walk away, his thoughts racing. He had always thought of himself as someone who was prepared for the spotlight, someone who could handle the pressure. But this was different. This wasn't about scripts, interviews, or public appearances. This was real. This was about survival. He stayed in the park for a while longer, the distant hum of city life around him barely registering. His mind was too consumed with the realization that his life had just taken a very unexpected turn. He couldn't trust anyone, not fully anyway, not even the people who had seemed to help him, not even Sarah, who had seemed so sincere. As he sat there, the weight of it all pressing down on him, he realized that he had no choice but to play along. He would have to be smart, to keep his wits about him, to stay ahead of whatever storm was coming his way. He would no longer be the passive participant in his own life. This was a game now. And Keanu Reeves had no intention of losing. The next few days were a blur of secret meetings, tense conversations, and watching his back more carefully than ever before. Keanu knew now that he wasn't just fighting for his reputation. He was fighting for his life. The days that followed felt like a constant game of cat and mouse. Keanu was on high alert, watching every move he made, every interaction he had, every corner he turned. The world he once navigated so effortlessly, an actor, a public figure, had transformed into a battlefield, with unseen forces lurking in the shadows, pulling strings and playing with his life like a marionette. He no longer trusted the people who had once seemed so benign, and the world outside felt like a maze of conspiracies and half-truths. Keanu had always been able to escape into his roles, to immerse himself in stories that allowed him to shed his own identity for a time. But now there was no escape. The lines between his own life and the stories he portrayed on screen were blurred, and the plot lines he had once controlled had now become unpredictable and deadly. One night, as he sat in his apartment staring at the phone in his hand, he knew it was time. The next step would either make or break him. He had to confront the people behind this, the ones pulling the strings, the detective, Sarah, no matter how much they had tried to help. He couldn't rely on them completely. He knew he had to take matters into his own hands. This wasn't just about surviving the plot they had set for him. It was about taking back control, about ending the madness before it swallowed him whole. The evening was cold, the sky shrouded in a deep layer of clouds, and Keanu dressed in dark clothes, hoping to blend in as he slipped into the streets of the city. His mind raced with every possible outcome. What if he walked straight into a trap? What if the people behind this were already watching, waiting for him to make a misstep? As he approached the same park where everything had started, he noticed something different. There were no joggers, no families, no people walking their dogs. The park was eerily empty, an unsettling silence filling the space. The familiar fountain, the benches, the trees, all seemed like a backdrop for a scene that had yet to unfold. Keanu's heart pounded in his chest as he walked down the path, keeping his senses heightened. The familiar sense of dread that had accompanied him in the past few days returned. He had no idea what he was walking into, but he couldn't turn back now. He had to face whatever was coming. And then, from the shadows, a figure appeared. It was Sarah. She stepped out from behind a tree, her face partially obscured by the hood of her jacket. Keanu stopped in his tracks, his pulse quickening. For a moment he couldn't tell if she was friend or foe. "Keanu," she said softly, her voice carrying an undertone of urgency. "You shouldn't be here, it's too dangerous." Keanu took a step forward, his expression hardening. "I don't have a choice. I need to know who's behind this. I need to know the truth." Sarah looked around nervously, then glanced at the ground. "I didn't want you involved in this, but now that you're here," she hesitated. "There's more at play than I've told you, much more. You're not just a pawn in this game. You're a key player." Keanu's breath caught in his throat. "A key player? In what? What is this really about, Sarah?" She stepped closer, her voice barely a whisper now. "You've been targeted because of who you are. You represent something people want to control. Your public image, your influence, it's all part of a bigger plan." Keanu's mind reeled. "A bigger plan? What are you talking about?" Before she could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed through the park. Keanu instinctively backed up against a nearby tree, his heart racing as he tried to make sense of what was happening. Sarah's expression changed, her face tense as she looked in the direction of the approaching footsteps. Two men emerged from the shadows, their figures tall and imposing. One of them wore a suit, his face cold and emotionless. The other was younger, wearing a hoodie and jeans. Keanu didn't need to ask who they were. He could feel the danger emanating from them. "Keanu," the older man said, his voice gravelly and authoritative. "We've been waiting for you." Sarah's face turned pale as she stepped back. "Keanu, no, you don't understand," but it was too late. The older man raised his hand, signaling to the younger one. Without warning, the younger man lunged forward, grabbing Keanu's arm in a vice-like grip, pulling him toward the center of the park. Keanu struggled, but the strength of the man's hold was overpowering. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the adrenaline coursing through his veins, as he realized just how deep this rabbit hole went. "You've been a thorn in our side for too long," the older man continued, his voice low and menacing. "But that ends tonight. You've made things more difficult than they needed to be." Keanu's mind raced. He had to act. He had to find a way out. He could feel the panic rising in his chest, but he couldn't let it take over. He needed to keep his wits about him, to stay calm and find a way to survive this. Just as the younger man tightened his grip on Keanu's arm, Sarah made a sudden move. She stepped in front of the older man, blocking his path. "Stop. This isn't what you want," she said, her voice filled with desperation. The older man sneered. "You've been too soft on him, Sarah. This is how it has to end. There's no other way." Keanu felt a sharp pang of confusion. Sarah, had she been part of this all along? Had she been working with them? But before he could ask, the world around him seemed to tilt. His vision blurred and everything went dark. When Keanu woke up, he was no longer in the park. He was in an unfamiliar room, dimly lit and cold. His hands were tied to a chair and his head throbbed with a dull ache. His mind struggled to piece together the events that had just transpired. His eyes scanned the room, and there, standing in front of him, was Sarah. But her expression was no longer the one he had seen in the park. It was hard, calculating, like a different person entirely. "I'm sorry, Keanu," she said quietly, her voice tinged with regret. But I had no choice. Keanu's heart sank as the truth hit him like a punch to the gut. The person he had trusted, the person who had seemed to be his ally, had been playing a part in the game all along. Hit subscribe and leave a comment. With where you're watching from, this story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward even when things get tough?